Margaret Whitmore was the kind of woman who could walk into any room and be noticed without saying a word. It wasn't just the sharp elegance of her appearance, the designer scarf draped just so, the perfectly pressed cream-colored slacks, the kind of understated luxury that whispered old money and old expectations. It was the air around her. The certainty. The entitlement polished by decades of getting exactly what she wanted. She was used to being in control. Not in the loud, brash way of self-made millionaires who clawed their way up. No. Margaret's power was quiet, refined, learned from years of leading charitable boards, making keynote speeches at galas, and managing people with a smile that rarely reached her eyes. She had long believed there was a natural order to things, an invisible line that kept certain people in certain places. It wasn't malice, she would say. It was just structure. Decorum. The way the world worked. But that morning at JFK International Airport, something small began to fracture in her perfectly structured world. And it started with a seat. Or more precisely, the person sitting next to it. The flight from New York to San Francisco was a routine she had perfected. First class only, of course. She never had to check her bags. Her matching Louis Vuitton set rolled silently behind her as she moved through security, with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. The lounge, the champagne, the casual nods from other high flyers, it was her domain. Predictable, polished, controlled. She was headed to a private business retreat in Napa Valley, where she would deliver a speech on legacy and leadership in the digital age. Margaret loved that phrase. Legacy. It made her feel timeless. As she waited at the gate, she FaceTimed her granddaughter. Just a quick call to check in before boarding. The girl was bouncing around in her pajamas, waving a crayon drawing at the camera. "Guess where Grandma is going again," Margaret sang gently. "Another airplane?" the little girl asked. "Yes, sweetheart. First class, the quiet part of the plane." She smiled as she ended the call, eyes crinkling at the corners. Everything was right where it should be, until it wasn't. Boarding was called, Group 1. She stood and smoothed her jacket, stepped forward with her usual grace. She didn't need to check her boarding pass. She always requested 2A, the window seat. It was the same every time. Predictable. Safe. But as she turned into the first-class cabin, her steps slowed. Someone was already seated in 2B. A man. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in a navy blue suit, eyes fixed on his laptop, typing with a quiet intensity that seemed immune to the flurry of movement around him. He didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge her. Margaret blinked. It wasn't that she hadn't seen black men in first class before. Of course she had. Athletes, occasionally. Musicians. She even once sat next to the CEO of a nonprofit who had been featured in Forbes. But this man didn't fit any of those labels in her mind. There was something about him. His calm. His silence. His complete lack of performance. He wasn't performing wealth or power. He wasn't trying to fit into the space. He simply was. Margaret paused, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the handle of her tote bag. He looked like he belonged, and that somehow unsettled her more than if he hadn't. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, perhaps a little louder than usual, and took her seat beside him without speaking. Her breath felt too loud in her chest. The scent of his cologne, subtle, woodsy, lingered in the air between them. He kept typing. She reached for the in-flight magazine, flipped through it without seeing the words. Her thoughts were racing, jumbled, chaotic in a way that made her uneasy. Why did he make her uncomfortable? No, that wasn't the right question. Why did he make her question her comfort? Margaret stole another glance at him. There was no name badge, no airline lanyard, no clues. Just a man. Focused. Unbothered. Unimpressed by her presence, which in her world was a kind of offense all its own. A flight attendant passed by offering champagne. Margaret took the glass but didn't drink. This wasn't how the day was supposed to begin. She glanced around the cabin. Familiar faces. The older man across the aisle who often lectured at Stanford. A venture capitalist 2 rows ahead who'd spoken at her conference last spring. Everyone settled into the silent elegance of first class. But next to her was this anomaly. This unexpected presence who, despite doing absolutely nothing wrong, had already knocked something loose inside her. A quiet anxiety, a rising pulse. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was jet lag, or nerves about her speech, or... But deep down, a seed had been planted, one she wasn't ready to name. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was disruption, the most dangerous kind. And even as the plane began to taxi down the runway, even as she turned toward the window and forced herself to breathe deeply, Margaret Whitmore couldn't stop the thought from bubbling up again and again. Who was this man? And what, exactly, was he doing in her seat of comfort? She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question would unravel her entire sense of place, of status, of power. It would shatter the illusion she'd built her world around, and it would all start here. In seat 2A. Tension is rarely loud at first. Sometimes it starts with a glance, a breath held too long, a question left unspoken but thick in the air. For Margaret Whitmore, it began with silence. The kind that prickles under the skin and makes the edges of reality feel just slightly off. As the plane lifted into the sky and the skyline of New York fell away behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this flight wasn't right. It was irrational, she told herself. The man next to her, this Malcolm Reed, though she still didn't know his name, wasn't doing anything inappropriate. He hadn't spoken a word to her. He hadn't infringed on her space or offered unwanted conversation. In fact, it was his total composure, his disregard for her presence, that unnerved her the most. He belonged there. That was the problem. Margaret had always taken comfort in subtle markers of class, in the small affirmations that signaled who was meant to be where. It wasn't about skin color, not exactly. At least, that's what she told herself. It was about polish, presentation, fit. She believed in a kind of unspoken order. But the man beside her didn't fit into that order. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he didn't look at her. She shifted in her seat, hoping for some kind of interaction, some cue that would restore balance. Nothing. Just the soft tap of fingers on keys, the occasional scroll on the trackpad. His focus remained entirely on his laptop. Margaret's discomfort deepened, coiling itself tighter around her ribs with each passing minute. She pressed the call button. A few moments later, Tara Mitchell, the lead flight attendant, approached with the grace of someone who had handled far worse. Tara was in her early 40s, the kind of woman who could navigate awkward conversations with a steady voice and an unshakable smile. Margaret had spoken with her on previous flights, briefly, warmly, from the comfort of assumed superiority. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Tara said, her tone as smooth as ever. "How can I help you?" Margaret smiled, controlled, measured. "I believe there might have been a mix-up with the seating assignments." Tara pulled out her tablet, tapped a few times, and then looked up with a polite, practiced expression. "You're in 2A, and this gentleman is in 2B. Both are correct." Margaret blinked. "Oh, that's strange. I just assumed... Never mind." She waved it off with a small, breathy laugh. Tara nodded, sensing there was more behind the comment but choosing not to engage. She moved on. Margaret sat back, but her chest was tight. Her assumption had been challenged and, worse, corrected. She glanced again at Malcolm. Still no reaction. She wanted him to notice, to acknowledge her presence. Not to apologize, no, that would be too much, but at least to validate that she had seen something out of place. He didn't. The absence of validation felt like a dismissal. A few minutes passed. Margaret's hand hovered over the call button again. She told herself she was overthinking, but she pressed it anyway. Tara returned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am?" Margaret leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I was wondering if there might be a different seat available. Somewhere else in the cabin." Tara's tone shifted, still kind, but edged with caution. "Is there a problem with your seat?" Margaret paused, just a moment too long. "No, not the seat itself. I just don't feel entirely comfortable where I am." Tara glanced at Malcolm. He had paused his typing, but hadn't looked up. His hands hovered above the keyboard, still, silent, waiting. "I see," Tara said, her voice more deliberate now. "Let me check." She tapped on her tablet again, her fingers moving with professional efficiency. Margaret looked around the cabin as if searching for someone to join her unspoken concern. She saw nothing but stillness. No one shared her unease. She felt alone in it, and that made her resolve harden. Tara returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am. First class is at full capacity today. There are no other available seats." Margaret's face didn't move, but inside, something twisted. "What about an economy?" she asked quietly, almost as a challenge. Tara hesitated. "There are a few seats open there, yes." Margaret let out a dry laugh. "That's not going to work. I didn't pay for first class to be asked to move." Tara didn't flinch. "Then I'm afraid this is your only option." Malcolm resumed typing. Margaret crossed her arms and looked out the window, pretending she was done. But she wasn't. Not even close. Her thoughts ran in circles. She remembered how her grandmother used to tell her to trust your instincts, how women in her family had survived through a kind of cultivated intuition. But what if those instincts weren't always right? What if they had been shaped by decades of subtle fears and biases, dressed up as decorum? She didn't want to think about that. Instead, she thought about how people like her had always known how to bend the world with a word, a suggestion, a whisper of concern. She had learned, without ever being taught, that certain phrases carried more weight than others. Phrases like, "I'm not sure this feels right," or "I'm uncomfortable," or "I don't feel safe." The words came to her fully formed. She didn't say them. Not yet. But they hovered in her throat, waiting. Across the aisle, an older man in a tweed blazer had been quietly watching. He didn't speak, but his eyes held something unreadable. She looked away. Margaret shifted again, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. Malcolm didn't acknowledge her, and that, more than anything, made her feel invisible. She had spent a lifetime being seen, being heard, being catered to in ways both subtle and overt. Now, she sat next to a man who seemed completely unmoved by her presence, unaffected by her attempts to reclaim control. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was infuriating. She would press the call button again. But next time, she wouldn't ask for another seat. She would ask for something more, something that would shift the weight of the conversation back to her favor. Or so she thought. The moment Margaret Whitmore said the words, she knew she could not take them back. "I don't feel safe." She had spoken softly, carefully, with that same practiced tone she had once used to excuse a difficult employee, to end a contract negotiation, to dismiss a housekeeper. It was the tone of someone who had learned long ago that if you whispered concern in just the right way, the world would bend to accommodate your unease. But this time, it didn't bend. Tara Mitchell, the flight attendant, froze for a second. The words didn't crash into the cabin. They slid in like a blade, thin and cold and deliberate. And even though Margaret had spoken quietly, the air shifted. The hum of conversations lowered. The rustle of newspapers stopped, and somewhere behind them, someone held their breath. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Tara said, the edges of her voice sharpening, "but I need to understand exactly what you mean." Margaret didn't flinch. "I just don't feel comfortable. I think it would be best if someone else took this seat." She didn't look at Malcolm Reed. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. But she could feel his presence more than ever now. Solid, unbothered, like a wall of silence she couldn't climb. Tara straightened her posture. "Are you suggesting this gentleman is a threat to your safety?" Margaret tilted her head, giving the smallest, most elegant shrug. "I'm not saying that. I just think it would be better if we weren't seated together." Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy sport coat lowered his phone and stared. A row behind, a woman raised her eyebrows and leaned toward her husband. Someone 2 seats down lifted their phone, angling the lens subtly forward. The moment was being recorded now, not just by a device, but by the room. Everyone was watching. Tara inhaled, eyes narrowing. "Just to clarify, ma'am, you are requesting that I remove a first-class passenger from his assigned seat, for no documented reason." Margaret nodded once. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was almost imperceptible. But it was enough. That's when Malcolm Reed closed his laptop. For the first time since she'd sat down, he turned fully toward her. His eyes met hers, calm and unreadable. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He looked measured, balanced, as if he were weighing something on invisible scales. Then he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a black leather case. He flipped it open and held it up. A flash of gold caught the cabin lights. FBI, Deputy Director, Cyber Investigations Division, Malcolm Reed. The room, already quiet, fell into something deeper. The kind of silence that comes after the final note of a concert. The kind that leaves people breathless, not knowing where to look. Margaret's spine stiffened. Her face flushed with something between shock and disbelief. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said, his tone even and unmistakably professional. "This is a federal aircraft. If you'd like to file an official report about feeling unsafe, I would be more than happy to take your statement now." His words weren't aggressive. They were surgical, precise, deliberate, exposing. Margaret opened her mouth, but the words tangled somewhere in her throat. No, she finally stammered. "No complaint." Malcolm nodded once and calmly placed his badge back into his jacket. Then, without another glance in her direction, he reopened his laptop and returned to his work. The silence lingered. It wasn't uncomfortable now. It was reflective. The cabin had seen something they couldn't unsee. Tara stood there for a second longer, her jaw tight, then turned to Margaret. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cool and clipped, "you have two options. You may remain in your assigned seat. Or, if you are unwilling to do so, we will arrange for you to deplane at the next available opportunity." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. Around them, people began to move again. Soft clinks of glasses, a cough from someone in row 1, but the energy had shifted completely. And Malcolm? He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply kept typing. That, more than anything, disarmed Margaret. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't basked in the reveal. He had let the facts speak. He had let the badge speak. And somehow, that restraint, his refusal to defend himself in any other way, made everything she had said feel even smaller, more absurd. A few rows back, the young woman holding her phone glanced at the screen, then back up at Margaret. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. That stung more than judgment. Margaret pressed her palms flat against her thighs, trying to steady herself. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. She had tried to leverage fear. She had played the part of the concerned passenger, hoping that the world would respond as it always had, with understanding, with deference. But this time, the script didn't work. This time, the man next to her wasn't powerless. He was the one with authority. And now the whole plane knew it. She had mistaken silence for weakness. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to fight. It was to reveal. She turned toward the window, shielding her face from the eyes she could still feel pressing in. She wanted to disappear, to go back 5 minutes, to unmake the choices she had just made. But the moment was carved into the air now, recorded, remembered, shared. The man she had tried to quietly remove from his seat had just shown her, and everyone else on board, that power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you and waits. By the time the wheels of the plane touched down in San Francisco, Margaret Whitmore's world had already begun to unravel. Not in the loud, catastrophic way she might have imagined. No explosive confrontation, no shouting, no arrest. It was quieter than that. Slower. More suffocating. Like a thread being pulled from the hem of a perfectly tailored dress. one that she hadn't even noticed until the fabric began to fall apart. Her phone buzzed the moment the aircraft taxied toward the gate, then again, and again. The screen lit up in waves of movement. Texts, emails, missed calls. She tried not to look, but curiosity proved stronger than pride. One notification preview read, "Margaret, please tell me this isn't you." She unlocked her phone with trembling hands. There it was, a video. Someone had uploaded it mid-flight. A 2-minute clip, filmed discreetly, showing her pressing the call button, Tara standing beside her, and Malcolm Reed holding up his FBI badge. It was shot from a slight angle, but her voice was audible. The words she had chosen so carefully, "I don't feel safe," rang out clearly, their weight no longer hers to control. The caption was damning in its simplicity. "Woman tries to have black man removed from first class. He's FBI." 58,000 views. Then 62. Then 75. The numbers were climbing with a momentum she couldn't comprehend. She turned off the phone. But silence didn't offer relief. It was too late. Her face, her voice, her choices, everything had been recorded. She could feel the eyes on her even as she stood to retrieve her bag. No one said anything. That somehow made it worse. The absence of confrontation gave space for judgment to settle in, thick and unspoken. As she stepped into the terminal, she instinctively reached for her sunglasses, even though the concourse was fluorescent and clinical. She hoped it might shield her, even just a little. She made it halfway to baggage claim before the next message hit. A voicemail from her daughter. "Mom." The voice was tight, breathless. "I don't know what happened, but the video's everywhere. Please don't speak to the media. Please, just call me when you can." Margaret didn't call. She didn't speak. She kept walking, each step heavier than the last. Outside the terminal, she climbed into a waiting town car, grateful for the barrier of tinted windows. The driver said nothing. She appreciated that. But the silence allowed her thoughts to scream. She had built a life on reputation, polished, respectable, admired. She sat on boards of philanthropic organizations. She was invited to give talks on ethics, leadership, and legacy. She had mentored young women on how to conduct themselves in high society. Now she was a viral cautionary tale. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back at the hotel, she peeled off her scarf, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened her laptop. She didn't go to the video, not at first. She Googled Malcolm Reed. What she found stopped her cold. An article in The Atlantic about his leadership in protecting election infrastructure. A feature in Forbes on his work combating international ransomware. A photo of him shaking hands with the Secretary of Homeland Security. Another with students at an inner-city high school, where he had launched a mentorship initiative. He wasn't just someone. He was someone who had spent his life building safety for people she'd never thought twice about. And she had tried to have him removed because his silence made her uncomfortable. She had spent her entire career convincing herself she stood on the right side of social issues. She donated to inclusive causes. She gave speeches about bridging divides. But in one moment, one single, private attempt to reclaim comfort, she had betrayed everything she thought she stood for. The worst part was knowing it hadn't felt malicious in the moment. It had felt logical. That was what haunted her. It wasn't hate. It was fear disguised as instinct. Bias dressed up as concern. And now, no one cared whether she meant it or not. She opened her email. The subject lines were lined with urgency. From the Marigold Foundation. "We regret to inform you." From Whitmore Investments. "Board meeting scheduled PR response." From a longtime colleague. "I can't believe you said that." She closed the laptop, leaned back, covered her face with her hands. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But her throat ached with the effort of holding everything inside. Margaret had always believed in the power of language. She had built a career on saying the right things, in the right rooms, to the right people. But no speech would save her now. No press release could erase the truth captured on that phone. The truth wasn't just what she said. It was what she meant. And the internet had already decided which was which. She thought of Malcolm then. Not the badge, not the title, But the look on his face, the restraint, the grace. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't gloated. He had let her reveal herself. And that, more than any public call-out, was the punishment that would stay with her. She considered writing an apology, but she didn't know who to send it to. And even if she did, she wasn't sure it would matter. Because this wasn't about redemption. Not yet. This was about recognition. Recognition of a moment that had stripped her bare. And the quiet man who, without saying a word, had shown her exactly who she really was. The story didn't end when the flight did. In many ways, that was where it began. As Margaret Whitmore stepped off the plane and into the cool, clinical sterility of the San Francisco terminal, her breath quickened, not from exertion, but anticipation. She didn't know what she was anticipating exactly. Judgment, isolation, a chance to make things right maybe. But what she felt instead was exposure, the kind that makes the skin crawl even under the softest clothes. Her phone buzzed again as she crossed toward baggage claim. One glance told her the story was no longer hers to control. The video had passed 300,000 views. Her name had been added to the hashtags. Woman in seat 2A, some called her. Others weren't as delicate. Screenshots from the clip had already made their way to Twitter. People dissected the arch of her brow, the tone of her voice, the way she had uttered those 5 words, "I don't feel safe." Someone had pulled up an old press photo from a gala years ago and compared it side by side to the still frame of her on the plane, mid-sentence, mouth parted in that moment before the mask had slipped. Comments flooded in. Observations, condemnations, sarcasm, think pieces. Margaret didn't speak to reporters. A few lingered just outside the arrivals area, their microphones poised, their questions already formed. She kept her head low and passed them quickly, her heels clicking like hammers against the tile. A cab was already waiting. She ducked inside and didn't look back. Across the city, Malcolm Reed was stepping onto a stage. It was a cybersecurity summit hosted at a downtown convention center. He had spoken at it for the past 5 years, often as keynote. This year, the turnout was larger than expected. The conference director had emailed him that morning. "Your session is oversold. We've had to open overflow rooms." He hadn't changed anything in his presentation. He hadn't addressed the video, hadn't mentioned the woman in seat 2A, hadn't even brought up the word discrimination. Instead, he talked about resilience, infrastructure, the fragility of truth in the digital age. But everyone in the room felt something else vibrating beneath his calm delivery. What Margaret had tried to unseat, Malcolm had carried into purpose. He stood before a room full of people not just as a professional but as a presence, unbothered, unmoved, unflinching. Later that evening, a blog post began circulating. It wasn't from a media outlet or activist group, but from a quiet corner of the internet, authored by the retired judge who had been seated across the aisle on the flight. The post was titled, "The Man Who Sat Still." "I've spent my life listening to arguments," the post began, "in courtrooms, on panels, in the press. But sometimes, the most powerful arguments are the ones made in silence." He recounted the moment Malcolm had presented his badge, the stillness of his voice, the precision of his response, the restraint. "There was a lesson in that," he wrote, "about dignity, about balance, about knowing who you are in a room that would rather not see you." The post went viral in its own quiet way, shared not for outrage, but for reflection. And for many, it hit harder than the original video, because it reminded people of something they'd forgotten. That power, when wielded responsibly, doesn't humiliate. It humbles. Back at her hotel, Margaret read the post twice. She didn't cry this time, not out of pride, but because she realized that nothing she said now could match the gravity of what had already been shown. Her own silence, her inability to see Malcolm as anything more than a disruption to her comfort, had been deafening. She picked up her phone, scrolled to her notes app, and began to write. It wasn't a public statement, not yet. It wasn't for her PR firm or her lawyer. It wasn't for damage control, it was for her. She wrote about discomfort, about how easily it disguises itself as instinct, about the lies we inherit without realizing they were lies to begin with. She wrote about silence. Not the kind that Malcolm had used to speak volumes, but the kind she had grown up with. Silence around race, power, and proximity. The kind that lets people look away from truths they don't want to see. She ended the note with a line she wasn't sure she was brave enough to say out loud. "I was afraid of a man who never raised his voice." In the following weeks, Margaret stepped down from every board she sat on. Not because she was asked to, though some would have asked eventually, but because she knew she couldn't offer anything of value until she understood the weight of the space she had once occupied so carelessly. She stopped speaking at leadership conferences. She declined media interviews. She started listening instead. The video would follow her for the rest of her life. She accepted that. But she also understood that the real lesson wasn't about what the world had seen. It was about what she had failed to see, until it was too late. Malcolm, meanwhile, never posted a word about the incident. He didn't share the video. He didn't speak of it at work, or during interviews, or in keynote addresses. He continued his work with quiet precision, building systems that made other people feel safe, even as someone had once tried to deny him that same courtesy at 30,000 feet. But those who were there, on that flight, would never forget him. Not because of the badge, not because of the title, but because when the moment came to respond to cruelty, he chose clarity. When he could have burned down the room with truth, he lit a small, steady lamp and let everyone see for themselves. And in that light, Margaret finally saw what she had refused to face. That some people carry the weight of dignity so fully, the only thing louder than their voice is their silence. Margaret Whitmore boarded that flight from New York to San Francisco, expecting routine, comfort, and control. Hallmarks of the world she had always known. For decades, she had lived in a carefully curated reality where privilege was the air she breathed. She was respected, accomplished, admired. But all it took was one unexpected presence. One man who didn't seek her approval, didn't perform for her comfort, to reveal how fragile that reality truly was. Malcolm Reed, a man of few words and deep purpose, didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself with anger, and didn't need to. His presence alone, and later, the quiet display of his FBI badge, shifted the dynamic of power in a way that was undeniable and irreversible. What started as a quiet moment in first class unfolded into a national conversation. Margaret's discomfort, once a private emotion, became a public spectacle. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was exposed. The internet didn't care about her intentions. It saw her actions, her assumptions, and her desire to remove someone who belonged every bit as much as she did. And that reality was devastating for someone who had built her life on being above reproach. Malcolm, on the other hand, walked off that plane without ever needing to explain himself. He didn't argue, didn't retaliate, and didn't demand justice through noise. He embodied it through composure. He reminded the world that sometimes silence is not surrender, it's strength. And when wielded by someone who knows their worth, silence can be more powerful than outrage. While Margaret's world unraveled thread by thread, Malcolm continued on his path, undisturbed and dignified, showing that true authority doesn't need validation. It simply exists. This story teaches us a critical lesson. Prejudice doesn't always wear a mask of hatred. Sometimes it's clothed in comfort, hidden in routine, disguised as instinct. Margaret wasn't cruel by intent, but intent is no shield against consequence. The world no longer makes space for quiet discrimination. In a time when every interaction can be witnessed, recorded, and shared, character is no longer private. It's public, it's visible, and it must be accountable. We are reminded that the way we perceive others says far more about us than it does about them. Comfort is not a justification for control. Fear is not an excuse for exclusion. And silence, when filled with integrity, can shatter even the most insidious assumptions. So how do we apply this lesson to our lives today? We start by questioning our instincts. We interrogate our discomfort. We listen more than we speak. And when we witness someone standing in their truth with quiet dignity, we don't try to move them, we move ourselves. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about how we treat one another in shared spaces, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful, thought-provoking content. Let's keep the conversation going, and keep building a world where dignity speaks louder than discrimination.